IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of All Things Policy, where we discuss policy issues of importance. Earlier this week, Arjun and Pranay recently published a new paper on the Hinrich Foundation titled Harnessing the Trade Policy for Building India's Semiconductor Industry. So we are having our episode which is based on that. Now, before we deep dive into the bits and pieces of the paper, Arjun, can you tell us or give us a gist about what this paper is about?
Hey Priyal, thank you so much for hosting the episode. Yeah, good to be here. So yeah, as you said, right, we just recently published a paper which looks at the trade policy issues and how trade policy can be used to build India's semiconductor ecosystem itself. The
Right.
paper is more on the lines of how the existing semiconductor or the global semiconductor industry has been developed and how trade policies and technology transfer agreements have played a very important role in building the ecosystem to where it is right now. So
Right.
all the bottlenecks, all the competitive advantages, and the ways of developing new technology in the semiconductor industry has
Hmm.
been driven a lot by liberal trade policies dating way back to the 1960s, 70s of Taiwan and the United States also. So the paper now mostly looks at the role of trade policies in India's current context. So we know that India has a large domestic market and is highly dependent on imports for semiconductors. And despite having a vibrant workforce, which is known for engineering and design, the country only has a very few manufacturing facilities, that too, which is operated by the government itself.
Hmm.
So it looks at how trade policies can be used for improving the ecosystem and improving India's global positioning itself in the semiconductor value chain. So
Right.
that's the basic part of the paper. But one thing we're also looking at is how countries have introduced kind of industrial policies way back in the 70s, 80s. But this industrial policies have not translated into actual growth and development of the industry itself. And they've had to kind of dial back whatever they've introduced and focus on other ways of improving the development of the industry. So this is where trade and technology transfer agreements come into the picture, and that's what we're trying to focus on. This is in context with India's recent semiconductor package, or like the industrial policy, which they released in December 2021. So we're saying how this is a good initiative, but there is no guarantee that this is going to translate into credible outputs, and they should also be looking at other avenues for developing the industry.
Right. So this is actually very interesting that you're looking into it. My one of the main question that I had to ask was like, why does trade policies and technology transfer agreements play such a huge and important role in building the semiconductor ecosystems?
Yeah, so this is again, as I said, right? This goes way back to the early 60s and 70s, and this and it is again it become a big deal and a big issue now because the chip shortage is still not abating. There
Yeah.
is a global chip shortage, and the semiconductor industry is not able to meet increasing sectoral demand, especially from automobiles to consumer electronics. So this has risen again to these kind of what we call techno nationalist cause, basically building self-sufficiency and inward looking policies wherein we say that we can do it on our own and we don't have to rely on anyone else for doing it. So that would be mostly on the lines of kind of trying to remove the existing choke points, which is currently in the production process itself. So this narrative can be problematic for especially for something like the semiconductor industry. It has always developed based on international cooperation, and this cannot be kind of restructured very quickly. The current structure, what is there for the industry now with it is a highly globalized value chain with you can see that a single chip which is going to be manufactured travels like almost across the globe from the design process to the final packaging process
Right,
itself.
right.
So this has improved the efficiency and productivity as different countries and companies focus on specific areas in the value chain which
Mhm.
they excel in. So they've reduced the risks of overcapacity and oversupply, and the global nature of the industry has led to increased and growing markets across the world, which has reduced the consumer prices. So if there was just one country which was producing everything, and it was exporting all across the world, that means that there would
Imbalance
be
sort of a thing,
yeah,
right?
yeah, there would be an imbalance and there would be an external dependency, and we would be at the mercy of the prices set by that country itself when they're exporting chips. Now that because it's kind of become a globalized value chain, it's resulted in lesser prices and easier access for people across the world itself. So they've always played an integral role in building these domestic semiconductor industries, and even the industry giants like Taiwan and Japan have kind of reached their stature they've reached where they are in the value chain because of more liberalized and open market policies. So they've allowed a free movement of labor, capital, and goods across markets. And this has helped them build a very robust infrastructure and focus on specific parts of the value chain, which they can, specialize in and have a comparative advantage in.
Right. So thanks for this. And this is quite interesting. But like the one of the things that you said was like, how the semiconductor industry is very globalized and why it is in that way and how it helps in like, maintaining the prices and avoids the monopoly of one particular country and stuff like that. So in this for the global semiconductor industry date, what were or what currently are the key drivers and what was the historical context behind this?
So there was this one thing which happened in the 1980s. So what happened was there was the US-Japan trade war in the 1980s, which was related to the semiconductor industry. So basically, manufacturers from the United States alleged that Japanese imports, especially memory chips and transistors, they were priced at very low prices, and they were hurting their businesses when they were exported to the United States. Now, at the same time, Japan had completely insulated its semiconductor industry from global competition,
Mm.
especially during the 60s and 70s. There was no international semiconductor company which was allowed to set up shop in the country. And this resulted in the United States government enacting what we call as the anti-dumping legislation. So basically, they introduced this to prevent Japanese imports, especially semiconductor imports, so that the US market would not be flooded with Japanese imports anymore. And this would give an opportunity for the US firms to capture the market for low cost memory chips. But this goal never materialized. So what happened was because people found out that these are just very low profit margins, and the specific product which itself, which is the memory chip, was not giving them the actual profit they wanted. And soon the American firms decided to move to other products which were capable of generating more revenue. So even it failed for the US and even the industry, which realized with too late that isolationist and protectionist policies have kind of had weakened the ability of their domestic firms to compete on the global stage. So that was kind of the context behind how this, calls for self-sufficiency and tech nationalist behavior in semiconductors had failed. And people understood that this was more of a win-win scenario. It's not a zero-sum game. for one country, and you have to cooperate with others to build on your own domestic ecosystem and industry and to be a part of the value chain. So that was the historical context behind this itself. Now,
Right.
coming to the key drivers, right? So there is there are many. So one is the fact there is a differentiation in human and financial resource requirements across various stages of the semiconductor production.
Okay.
So because of the fact that there is a difference in production, like the production process itself has different stages, and each country or each there is specialized or comparative advantages for countries in part of the production process. Like manufacturing has become a major thing with Taiwan. Equipment for developing and manufacturing equipment for using in the process of fabrication, that Netherlands and Japan have kind of dominated the market. So
Right.
all these processes have different requirements, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not just one single uh, kind of a thing wherein you have just, if you have a large labor force, you will definitely, you know, make a mark in the industry or in the value chain. Or if you have a very skilled labor force, you will do it, because each production stage has a different requirement. It has kind of burgeoned into a global or a international cooperation thing wherein each country looks at where they can contribute to, and
Contribute.
yeah, and then they have made it a point to build on that and be a part of the industry. So that is one. And also there have been because of the competitive global value chain, it has also elevated the standards of semiconductor production itself. So the quality and specifications, especially the exports from Taiwan, South Korea, and all, have risen the stature of how these products are. And trade friendly policies have promoted the manufacturing of small and large scale electronics itself. That's also one thing. And the fact that there is, like during the 70s, 80s was when there was this whole concept of East Asian tigers, right? So there was opening up of the economy, and especially countries in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and even East Asia like Japan, South Korea, they had a period of like high economic growth. This was basically because of this positive business environment, which is created by certain countries that kind of attracted semiconductor giants, because like there were these global semiconductor firms who were looking to lower their import duties, have low tax rates, so that they could spend more on research and development. For example, like Fairchild Semiconductors, which was basically a US firm, did us move its assembly line process to Hong Kong in 1961, and citing low tax rates and duties, the fact that it was closer to consumer market. So basically, they knew that if they had to export, they might rather have exported from finished goods from Hong Kong to Asian markets rather than from the US itself. So that kind of also helped move their processes and to business friendly environments. And many US semiconductor firms began doing this. They started moving their labor intensive operations overseas to Southeast Asia because there was a lot of human capital and there were cheap labor available. So
Right.
now, countries which were looking to be a part of the value chain grabbed on this opportunity and said that, look, you can come here and do it, and we will provide whatever you want. You can set up whatever shops you want. So, that positive business environment, which was created by certain countries, especially in Southeast Asia and East Asia, helped many other countries also get integrated into the value chain and ensured that there was this smooth transition and globalized structure itself. So that's one more thing. And finally, yeah, so there were these legal frameworks which were protecting IP rights, and this was provided through multilateral trade agreements that kind of helped strengthen the sector a lot. And because intellectual property was so critical for the industry itself, and there was this whole thing about, like multilateral trade agreements such as the TRIPS agreement, which was trade related aspects of intellectual property, right? This was in 1995, which was signed by all WTO member states. They clearly defined IP rules, and they had a minimum set of procedures for enforcing IP, national IP enforcement itself. So the agreement also covered three areas which were very specific to the industry, which was protection of the trade secrets, protection of integrated circuit layout design. So basically, any design of the chip itself was under IP protection, and it also safeguarded under any compulsory licensing of semiconductor related IP. So it could not force any firm to license their own architecture or their own design
Mhm.
on, like, they couldn't do it on by force. Like, it could be only when the firm decided to say that, okay, fine, others are allowed to use, and they could license it out. So this kind of, because I protected by multilateral trade agreements, it kind of ensured that people were part of these agreements, and whoever were part of the semiconductor value chain were actually integrated with these trade agreements itself. So yeah, these were basically some of the main things which happened that kind of ensure the industry grows and have a more globalized structure.
Right. But that's like really that. Thank you for giving such a detailed and such a well put out answer. That actually tells you everything about like starting from the historical context of what currently is happening in the semiconductor world, right? Now, before we
Yeah.
actually move on, I think we would want to focus on the Indian side of things. And before we go there, let's take a short break and we will be right back.
Hello, hello, hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says It's Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Nivedita, Tony, and Antrix discuss the new IVM merch, which you should definitely go check out on our website, ivmpodcast.com. You can click the shop tab, and that will take you to our partner, Grow91. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff there, which you should definitely check out. But besides the IVM merchandise, they also discuss thieves who perform puja before looting gold and cash worth rupees 34 lakhs in Kerala. Also, we would like to let you know about something we're very proud of. We've started this new podcast called the Vox Podcast in association with MMA India. It's about all things audio. Karthik Nagarajan, who also hosts the Filter Coffee podcast with us, talks to Anil Vishwanathan. He's the Senior Marketing Director at Mondelez India, and they discuss the innovative use of voice and audio. Speaking of Karthik Nagarajan, on the Filter Coffee podcast, Virali Modi tells Karthik what it's like being disabled in India. The Simplified Gang dive into the manure pile to explore how much our country spends on fertilizer. On All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk analyze the policy implications of the 5th National Family Health Survey report. And on Say No to Drama, Chitna asks us to realign the stories we've been telling ourselves. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcast has launched merchandise and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcast website and click on the shop tab and check out the first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media as well. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Apple, wherever you do that, that is really helpful for us. And do remember, you can also check a lot of our shows out on YouTube. If you go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, you get a list of all of our channels. We're also doing a small listener survey, so please do help us out with that. If you go to ivmpodcast.com/survey, it'll help us understand a little bit more about our listeners. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Jupiter, a digital banking app, and Capgemini. Get the future you want. Thank you so much. Without you guys, this wouldn't be possible.
Hello and welcome back. We were talking to Arjun regarding the recent paper that him and Pranay had published. And we have already discussed about how the trade policies and technology transfer agreements play important role in building semiconductor ecosystems, as well as the historical context behind the semiconductor industry trade. Now, moving on to the Indian side of things, we already know that India does have a semiconductor industry, right? Now, if India does choose to, or decide to focus on revamping its trade policies to sort of improve the current semiconductor industry that is present, what are the potential roadblocks do you see that the government might face while formulating this policy or while implementing this policy? Arjun?
Yeah, so that's a nice way to put it, because um even if the government decides to somehow, completely overhaul the existing system and
Right.
decide to bring in, liberalized trade regime, there will be certain external factors which it is not dependent on, and that might prove a hindrance itself. So one is definitely the restrictions on human capital movement. So especially in this day and age after the COVID-19 pandemic, this the whole cross-border movement of goods and services have kind of, you know, dialed down a bit. And
Right.
especially in a capital and labor intensive industry such as the semiconductor one, both high skilled and low skilled workers are required in different areas of the value chain. So let's say high skilled workers are required for operating critical manufacturing equipment during fabrication process, and low skilled workers are needed when there is assembly, testing, and
Mhm.
packaging part of it. So for this, there has to be a free exchange of labor across countries, and this cross border movement of labor becomes critical.
Right.
And if you think about it, Taiwan also did this when they started building their industry. So what they did was this whole concept of science parks, which was basically like a tech, what we have tech parks in India right now or in Bangalore
Yeah,
right
yeah.
now. So it was basically they built these science parks, and which was meant to host semiconductor firms and research laboratories, and even offer incentives for universities to come and set up their own research lab there. They did was they provided upfront capital and including tax reductions, which was allowing companies to relocate along with their operations. So
Right.
what this ensured that there was this huge influx of engineers from the US. They provided housing, schools,
Oh,
and
nice.
everything inside the park itself for whoever were the high skilled labor who were migrating from the US to the
Right,
tech
right.
park. And also the fact that workers were provided upskilling opportunities and on the job training. So this kind of had a seamless transfer of labor and built a
Mhm.
very nice industrial cluster, which is now worth billions and billions of dollars.
Wow.
Yeah. But now that kind of movement of labor across countries will be a huge challenge. And we know that the per capita income of India remains on the lower end of the spectrum, like
Mhm.
the US or Taiwan. And attracting skilled workers from these countries will require additional financial support from the government, as well as a very favorable investment climate.
Right.
And that is something that we kind of have a major problem in.
Mhm.
And one more thing would be a fear of weaponization itself, because in recent times, this kind of the semiconductor technology has been used for both civilian and military purposes. They have realized that there has been an increase in the uh, military applications and defense applications of these chipsets. And especially recent events such as the Russia Ukraine conflict have increased geopolitical concerns about the semiconductor supply chain. So they've kind of raised the fears of how this technology can be used to weaponize certain militaries, and this can actually increase then more calls for techno nationalist tendencies, basically saying that we are not going to share any like critical technology with you, regardless of whether you are a ally or not. But again, in terms of India, India is not an ally of the United States, or because they haven't kind of signed on to any pact which says so, and there is no military kind of relationship between India and the US. So it becomes harder for them to kind of get that semiconductor technology from them if
Right.
there is this fear of weaponizing it. And also the fact that there have been export controls which have been put. For example, there is the multilateral agreement, which is called as the Wassenaar Agreement. So,
Hmm.
agreement has 42 signatories, including US, Japan, South Korea, and stuff.
Oh, wow.
And as per the list, export controls on specific technologies have been includes more than 150 semiconductor products and more than 20 types of manufacturing equipment related to semiconductors. So, um, it also, the United States Export Control Reform Act, which is the CRA in
Right.
2018, also identifies these export controls as essential for technologies which are
Right.
directly related to the country's national security. So these kind of export controls which have already been put on semiconductor technology will hamper the chances of other countries such as India to get access to critical materials and equipment also.
Right.
So that is one more thing. And this whole concept of import restrictions will always be there
Yeah.
until it kind of decides to revamp its whole thing. So basically, when the government announced the package, right? So there were the industry body, which is called as the Indian Cellular and Electronics Association, the
Right.
ICA, reminded the government that the rates for semiconductor imports remain very high, and these restrictions are very. There are high tariffs, and this would kind of dilute the effect of the industrial package itself. So you're offering money in one way and you're taking away money in another way. So which would kind not have the desired output as the government wants. So that is also going to continue to hamper the growth of India in the industry. And the government should actually prioritize reducing the tariffs for these components. Now they've introduced the financial incentives, but to keep the operations running would require a constant flow of essential goods at lower prices. So on the only way to do that would be to kind of restructure import rules and regulations and to facilitate such a influx of goods into the country.
Yeah, now that you sort of like pinpoint some of the things like some of the roadblocks, some of the problems that the government might face, right? Now, coming from your perspective, what are the broad recommendations like you would suggest to sort of leverage and utilize the trade policies to currently to sort of build and improve the existing semiconductor package introduced by the government of India?
Yeah, so in the paper itself, we go into like these two, three broad policies or
Okay.
policy recommendations we make. Yeah, as I said, one is just the way you structure your trade policy. So whatever existing distortive practices which are there should be eliminated. So there should always be a market-based cooperativeness.
Right.
This will this will ensure that even the domestic firms are challenged on the global market based on their quality, with the quality of their products, rather than the fact that they're supported and popped up by the government itself. So
Right.
I understand that government commitment is necessary to build a vibrant domestic industry, but like you cannot completely favor just the domestic industry, and this would incentivize anyone else from actually giving their products to us, and
Right.
when we kind of actually need it from them, and it might take a long while for the domestic industries to rise to where the other giants are. So we cannot just one day come up and say that we're going to build a photolithographic equipment and we are not going to rely on Netherlands or ASML for it,
Yeah.
because that will take time. And even if the government puts in, I don't know how many ever crores of rupees they want, it is the time taken for them to build an indigenous manufacturing equipment would reduce the effectiveness of what they claim to have, like in the sense
Right.
of they could have instead manufactured a lot of chips by importing certain
Right.
equipment also. So one thing we also suggest is the India being part of the World Semiconductor Council. This is
Okay.
an international forum which brings together leaders and experts across the industry, and it is comprises of industry associations of Japan, South Korea, US, Europe, China, and Taiwan. These are the
Okay.
major industry associations which are part of the council. And what it was established in 1996, and it promotes international cooperation to facilitate the industry's long-term growth, and is a strong proponent of free trade. So
Okay.
it's guided by the principle of respecting market principles and WTO rules. and the fact that there has to be open markets without discrimination. Competitiveness of companies and their products should be a principal determinant of their success and trade. So
Right.
now any aspiring member must meet one of the two criteria regarding tariff elimination. So either they have to eliminate all tariffs related to semiconductors, or
Okay.
they should commit themselves to eliminating these tariffs on a expedited basis, or like these tariffs until a certain, like if they until they can eliminate them. So if India commits to this, right, so they would get investor confidence and potential partners to
Right.
come into the country, and also access to free trade with other industry associations such as Japan or Taiwan or Europe or
Okay.
anything. So
Right.
one is that, and the second is mostly the ITA expansion. What is now, there's this agreement called the Information Technology Agreement, which was in 1996.
Mm-hmm.
So India was originally actually a signatory for the 1996 agreement, but there was also an expansion done in 2015, which
Okay.
resulted in the addition of over 200 technology products to the agreement.
Right.
And basically the agreement says that there should be no tariffs and there should be no duties which are be imposed upon these kind of technology
Mm-hmm.
products. So at that time, India argued that the agreement would impact the domestic electronics manufacturing sector and would like create an over reliance on imported goods.
Okay.
But now it is in India's interest to actually sign the expanded ITA, because the wide range of technology products offered by the ITA can ensure that semiconductors would be at the forefront of India's technology trade. So
Right.
India has not kind of been part of any trade agreements such as the
Mm-hmm.
RCEP or even the CPTPP or anything like that. So they need something, if some kind of multilateral trade agreement, to ensure that they have access to a large market, and
Right.
this at lower prices. So it is in India's interest to kind of sign the expanded ITA, and that's what we suggest. And also finally, it's just they have to promote a IP protection and technology transfer regime. They have to have a tight-knit framework for ensuring technology transfer agreements happen. And again, this is a lesson from Taiwan itself, because in Taiwan was basically an agricultural economy in the 1960s. They did not know anything about semiconductors, like
Right.
literally
Right.
nothing. So
Yeah.
what they decided to do, the government decided to ink a deal with the Radio Corporation of America, and basically agreeing to transfer technology related to manufacturing the CMOS. Basically, it was a CMOS technology, and they
Okay.
decided to send their engineers over to America to learn about the technology, to
Oh,
learn how
nice.
to implement it. Once the agreement was signed, and they sent their engineers over there who learned about it, and
Mm-hmm.
they came back and they set up the national industry in Taiwan, and
Hmm.
that led to the growth of what we know now as TSMC and UFC, which was supported and propped up by the government. And finally, slowly they increased private investment, and slowly the government started reducing its stake in the companies itself. So
Right.
literally the entire industry what Taiwan has built right now was basically just from a one single technology transfer deal which was signed with the US,
Hmm.
and that gave an impetus for every for engineers across the in their own country to develop and increase their knowledge and ensure that they could move forward with their own industry. So, if India can have a mechanism for protecting semiconductor related IP, ensure that if there is a technology transfer agreement which is happening with, let's say, the US or with Japan or something, there should be tight knit framework, and also the enforcement of strict rules against IP theft and other
Right.
regulations. So this would actually, like have very major signaling itself to the international market, and like would ensure that innovation based competition
Mm-hmm.
is promoted in the long run rather than, IP theft or anything like
Right.
that. So yeah, basically that's what we suggest. And we think that if the government could look at trade and technology transfer from a lens of, complementing the existing package rather than, going against what they've already introduced, that would make it a better outcome for the industry itself.
Okay. That's very interesting. And these are some really good suggestions, right? Because at the end of the day, we will still want to play by India's strengths, and that's exactly what we want. But thank you so much, Arjun, for joining me at this episode and giving us and the listeners all the details and going into detail about the paper that you've written and everything about like the India semiconductor industry and what can be done and the history and everything.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think we'll just link the paper in the show notes. So,
Sure.
So that anyone who's interested and may actually go read it. But it's just an effort to make people understand that, just having the government come out with a bunch of money and saying that, no, we will invest. I mean, this is meant for an industry will not exactly always yield the same result. And
Right.
You might have to actually look at different areas such as trade.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Arjun. Thank you for joining me at this episode. And to all our listeners, thank you for listening. We will be back with the next episode. So, bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
You're the people pleaser, right? Or then desperately seeking the one? Or wait, you're the one who doesn't think they're ever good enough. So much drama. And for what? Is it doing you any good? Listen to me. I'm Chetna, your favorite positive action coach. Yes, I'm the one who has been dropping all those truth bombs on every episode. And it's time you learn to say no to drama. That's also what my podcast is called. And a new episode is out every Monday and Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, as well as all major podcasting platforms.